This is a lecture on the historical reliability of the history of Eungchil. That's Ahn autobiography. This is a lecture I plan on giving at the 2018 Ahn workshop at the Ahn Memorial Hall in Seoul, Korea. One thing that we have to keep in mind about history is that history is actually a practical field of study, especially when we keep in mind the idea of constructing a usable past. A lot of people have lived throughout history. There are a lot of historical facts, but we pick particular people, places, and times to talk about, to study. And those are people who seem relevant somehow to our current present, right? So when historians ask questions about particular historical time periods, oftentimes those questions are built to help find answers that will help us in our day-to-day lives, that will help us to make sense of the reality that we currently live in. Now, there's other purposes of history, of course. Sometimes it's just good to know ancient history or things like that. But we tend to focus on aspects of history that help us to understand the world in which we live, and especially to draw lessons from. So to give you an example, if you go to Korea and you go to kind of the road that bisects Seoul, you'll see this monument. And this is a monument to Admiral Yi Sun-shin. You can see him. He's there with his sword. Beneath him is his famous turtle ship. And he is famous because he helped defeat the Japan's invasion of Korea in the 1590s. And so he's a kind of a martial hero that Koreans are very proud of. He was a virtuous person, and he loyally served a government that oftentimes did not necessarily treat him all that well. And behind him, and you can barely make him out, but he's there behind him, is King Sejong, who of course is most famous for developing the Korean alphabet. And you may, and I want to stress, those two figures were chosen and put there together for specific reasons, right? There were lots of Korean people they could have put there. There were lots of different ways of organizing this monument, but they put those two people there for a particular reason, right? And it's kind of funny, right, in a sense, because if you go up this road, you're actually probably going to see Admiral E first and then the king. And that seems kind of weird, right? Because isn't a king more important than a general? Especially a king who develops Hangul, the Korean alphabet. Well, the answer, though, of why it's arranged like this is quite simple. Admiral Yi Sun-shin is protecting the Korean king, right? So there's this guy who, of course, is connected with culture. So there's a moral lesson here, right? Koreans are being taught by the selection of these two figures and by their arrangement that in order to maintain their distinctive identity and culture, they must have a strong country and they must loyally serve that country. Right? So that's an example of a usable past. Koreans could have picked lots of different people to examine, to include here, but they chose these two particular heroes to emphasize an important lesson, that without a strong country, it would be impossible to have a distinct Korean identity. However, in order for us to gain a useful lesson about the past, that past must be true, right? In order for the past to be truly useful, we have to come to an accurate understanding of the past. If our understanding of the past is flawed or incorrect, that will lead us to make incorrect decisions today, right? So if we don't understand the past properly, we will make decisions that are poor. On the other hand, if we understand the past truly and correctly, we are more likely to make good decisions. And what's key for coming to an understanding of true history, to correctly understand history, we have to make sure that we're building our history on reliable sources, right? There's this big question, can we trust our sources? So if I'm reading a document about Admiral Yi Sun-shin or about King Sejong, is this a true document? Does this actually tell us something about these individuals, right? If we don't have good sources, we can't write true history. And if we can't write true history, we can't use history to better understand the present in which we live, and we can't use it to help us make decisions that help guide us to do what is right. Now, we are fortunate, of course, to have a lot of documentation about King Sejong and about Admiral Yi Sun-shin. And So we are pretty sure, because we have so much documentation about them, that the basic facts of their life, the fact that they were pretty heroic individuals, we know that to be true. Now, as I mentioned, there are not the only heroes of Korea, of course. There are other heroes who Korea has commemorated. And one very important hero of Korea is Ahn Gun, right, who's often called by Koreans Ahn Gun Uisa, which means patriotic hero, basically. And he's considered so important that pretty much every Korean knows him. When I tell Koreans, oh, I study Ahn Gun, none of them say, who is that? They'll usually say something, oh, he's a great patriot. And importantly enough, people were willing to spend money to build this, gorgeous Ahn Gun Memorial Museum in his honor. So he's a very, very important historical figure, just like King Sejong and Admiral Lee Sun-shin. Now, unfortunately, unlike Admiral Lee Sun-shin and King Sejong, for a long time there weren't a lot of historical sources about Ahn Gun. He wrote a little bit while he was in prison that was immediately available shortly after his execution. But the primary source for many years about Ahn Gun's life and thought were his trial transcripts, were what he said when he was put on trial for killing Ito Hirobumi. And I'll talk more about those trial transcripts later. But for many decades, those were our primary sources about Ahn Gun. Now, it was known that he had been writing an autobiography and had also been writing an essay about what he thought needed to be done in East Asia to bring peace. But those documents were not extant. No one knew where they were, right? And they were thought to be lost. So it was kind of unfortunate, right? Koreans had this great hero that they respected and admired, but they didn't have a lot of documents on him. They knew that these documents existed, but they didn't know where they were. So for many decades, as I said, they had to rely on these trial transcripts. Now, what ends up happening, though, in 1969, a person discovers an apparent Japanese translation of Ahn Gun's autobiography, which is called The History of Eungchil. Eungchil was his childhood name, which he used as an alias, and part of his unfinished essay on peace in the East. And I'm going to be talking a lot about the history of Ahn Eungchil, whereas my colleague Dr. Han at the actual workshop will be talking about peace in the East. So they discovered a Japanese translation of these two documents, these purported writings of Ahn Gun. Then, 10 years later, in 1979, a retired history professor discovered in the Japanese Diet Library classical Chinese versions of these manuscripts. And that's very important because Ahn Gun knew classical Chinese. He did not know Japanese. So discovering the classical Chinese was very important because that would be the original, right? Or I should say the original text. It's not the original manuscript. This appears to be a copy. But it would be the original language in which Ahn Gun wrote these documents. So as you can imagine, this was quite a big deal, right? This was really wonderful for people who studied Ahn Gun because here we had writings that seemed to have been produced by Ahn Gun himself. It's not the court trial transcripts, which was someone else writing down these words. This is what Ahn Gun himself wrote. So there was a lot of excitement at the discovery of these documents. Now you might notice, though, there's kind of a problem here. Ahn Gun was executed in 1910. The Japanese translation of these documents was discovered in 1969. In 1979, a classical Chinese version, which represents the original text as it had been written, but this was likely a copy, not the thing that Ahn Gun actually wrote himself, was discovered. So there's a big gap there, right? Between 1910 and 1969 and 1910 and 1979, that's a lot of time. That gives ample opportunity for someone to have either edited these documents, in which case they would represent Ahn Gun's ideas but heavily edited, or someone could just have forged it. These documents could theoretically be forgeries, which Ahn Gun himself did not write. And some people have raised this concern, and some people have personally to me have asked me if I think that certain parts of the autobiography are authentic or not, right? So this is the problem that we're going to try and tackle here. In a sense, my question here is, did Ahn Gun write these things? When you read the autobiography, and by extension also the Peace in the East, are you reading Ahn words and thoughts, or are you reading something that is something that is heavily edited or a complete forgery? My view is that the history of Eungchil, his autobiography, is a reliable and authentic document that was written by Ahn to justify the decisions he made in his life, as an attempt to win support for his idea that Japan should change its policy in Korea, and as a memoir. And the rest of this presentation is me trying to convince you that this is in fact what Ahn was doing. Before, though, trying to convince you, I need to lay down some kind of ground rules for how historians do things. People are often used to, I think, thinking scientifically, right? In science, we use direct observation and experimentation to find certainty. So, in this picture, we have this kind of famous experiment you probably did as a kid to explain the scientific method. You had one plant that was exposed to sunlight, another plant was covered so it could not receive sunlight, and the plant, of course, that had sunlight grew a lot better than the plant that did not. And the idea is that this proves something, and you can continuously repeat it to make sure that this is actually true in all cases, right? And this is how science, in a sense, works. You do an experiment, and you repeat that experiment, and if you always get the same results, that would represent that you've discovered some sort of scientific law, some kind of principle of the universe. Yes, indeed, plants grow better when they have sunlight than when they don't. That allows you to know that with certainty, right? There's no doubts there that that's how things work. However, this is not how history works. History does not allow us to repeat experiments. History does not allow direct observation. With history, you only have one opportunity to witness things. You only have the documents produced from that period to use as evidence. And so don't think about these things scientifically. We have to think about them historically. Historians can't know things with certainty. Instead, what we do is we look and see which explanation has the most probability. Right? Historians use reason, and we carefully look at historical sources to figure out which interpretation of those sources has the most probability of actually happening. Right? That's what historians do. So let me give you kind of a simple and kind of a silly example. Right? There are some people who claim that aliens built the pyramids. Right? There's some people who claim that aliens built the pyramids. Now, is that possible? Well, yes, it's possible. It is possible that aliens exist. And we know that pyramids exist. And it's possible that aliens could have come to Earth and helped humanity build the pyramids. However, if we actually study the development of pyramids over time, and Egyptian historical writing about pyramids, we will see that pyramids started off as very simple structures and then developed over the years into much, much more complex structures as Egyptians learned more about engineering. So, that response seems much more probable, right? We don't need to bring in space aliens to explain why the pyramids were built. It's enough just to look at the evidence and say, yeah, human beings could do this. They could figure this out. So while it's possible, of course, that aliens exist and that they came and built the pyramids, it is much more probable that human beings did so through a process of engineering and trial and error and so forth. So that's why historians teach that the Egyptians, human beings, built the pyramids. Both are possible, but the idea that human beings built the pyramids is highly probable, whereas the one that the aliens did is highly improbable. And historians, we deal with probability, and we accept the historical interpretation that is the most probable. So which possibility then is the most probable? That's what we have to kind of think about. And I think there's four major possibilities. One is that Ahn wrote the document himself. Ahn actually wrote the autobiography himself. The second is that Ahn wrote the document himself with some minor editing from someone else. The third is that Ahn wrote the document himself with some major editing from someone else. And the fourth is that someone else wrote the document. My argument is that number one is the most probable. Number two, I think, is also possible, has a high level of possibility, but I think it's not nearly as much as number one. I think 3 and 4 are highly improbable. And so I'm going to try and convince you that one, is the most highly probable, and is actually much more probable than the other three. Now, before, though, we talk about Ahn Cheung-gun's autobiography directly, we need to talk about his trial. The trial is very, very important for several reasons. As you can see from this photo, and you can see Ahn Cheung-gun on the right there, those four men in the front, this was a public trial. Ahn Cheung-gun, a Korean, killed Ito Hirobumi, a Japanese person, on territory that belonged to the Qing Empire, China, but was being administered by Russians. So what that meant was this was an international case. This was an international incident when Ahn Cheung-gun killed Ito Hirobumi. And the whole world was curious about what was going on. This meant that Japan had to give Ahn Cheung-gun a public trial. So a lot of those people there are members of the public. They're not government officials. They are people who actually got tickets and were able to attend. Right? Anyone, in fact, could get a ticket, basically. So this is key. This was a public trial. Now, what this meant is that there are actually two versions of the trial transcripts, right? People wrote down what was said at trial. One of those versions is the official government version. Another version was taken down by a Japanese journalist who then published it. And these trial transcripts are very similar. There's some small differences, which don't really concern us here. They're very minor. What's key, though, is that they are very consistent with each other. In addition, there were other newspaper reporters who reported on the trial as well and give a summary of the cases. And what's striking is that in both trial transcripts and the various summaries, Ahn Cheung-gun's ideas are consistent throughout all of them. Right? If you read the trial transcripts and you read the summaries, you see one Ahn Cheung-gun. This would indicate that these are reliable sources. That if you want to know what Ahn Cheung-gun thought, look at his trial transcripts. Right? Because we have multiple versions of these same texts, multiple summaries that agree with each other. That would indicate that what he said there, or what these transcripts say he said there, he actually did in fact say. So we can believe what the words and the ideas in these trial transcripts, these are actually Ahn Cheung-gun's words and ideas. So what were those words and ideas? Well, first of all, Ahn Cheung-gun argued at trial that the peace in Asia had been disturbed by Japan's encroachment on Korean sovereignty. If Japan changed its policy to support Korean independence, then there would be peace in East Asia. And this is a key central idea to Ahn's thought. Ahn linked Korean independence with peace in East Asia. If Korea remained an independent country, if Korea's independence was strengthened, then you would have peace in East Asia. Right? Very simple idea. And Ahn Cheung-gun mentioned it many times in his autobiography. And Ahn was very clear, at his trial, and also in his autobiography. Now, as such, Ahn was not anti-Japanese. He was anti-Ito Hirobumi. You're not going to find anything really anti-Japanese really in any of Ahn's writings. He was not anti-Japanese. He thought that Ito Hirobumi was leading Japan against the wishes of the Japanese emperor along a wrong path. So Ahn was not against Japan. Ahn, in fact, if you look at his other writings, wanted Japan to help Korea, but to help Korea in a way that respected Korea's independence. And as such, Ahn's ideas are very reflective of his historical context. A Korean would not write this way in 1915, after Korea had become annexed. A Korean would probably not write this way in 1890, when it wasn't clear how powerful Japan was going to be. Ahn's ideas here put him strongly in his historical context, right? Especially his focus on peace in the East. He tries to present himself as a civilized and enlightened person, and he also shows a kind of understanding of Asianism that belongs to this time period. So I want to stress this again. Ahn's ideas here, Korea should be independent. If Korea's independence is not respected, that will lead to conflict and war. And that's exactly what Ito Hirobumi is doing. So Japan needs to change its policy to support Korean independence. Then there will be peace in the East. And this is reflective of what we would expect a Korean like Ahn Cheung-gun to say in the year 1909. Now, being a historian, I don't think it's enough just to tell you something. I need to show you something. So to kind of prove my point, here is an excerpt from Ahn Cheung-gun's third trial session. And he stated, according to this excerpt, "I did not carry out this evil act for myself, but for peace in the East." In his declaration of war against Russia, the Japanese emperor stated that Japan was fighting to maintain peace in the East and strengthen Korean independence. Therefore, when Japan rejoiced at its victory over Russia, Koreans were just as happy as the Japanese. When Prince Ito came to Korea as resident general, however, he was able to trick the Korean people, both high and low, and concluded the Five-Article Treaty of 1905. Because this was against the will of the Japanese emperor, the people of the nation became angry with the resident general. Then Korea was also forced to accept the Seven-Article Treaty of 1907. Not only did Korea not gain anything from this, Prince Ito did the unthinkable and forced the Korean emperor to abdicate. Thus, people saw Resident General Prince Ito as their arch enemy. So you see those ideas, right? You see Ahn Cheung-gun connecting peace in the East with Korean independence. You can see he does not take an anti-Japanese attitude. He's only critical of Ito, right? So you can see that here clearly. Now, one thing I want to stress, though, there's some areas I marked. I did not carry out this evil act. Resident General Prince Ito. That's kind of weird, right? And this actually represents, I believe, minor editing. The court case was actually carried out in Japanese, and then Korean translation was provided for Ahn Cheung-gun. So I think what happened is when this, either the Japanese interpreter interpreted Ahn's words or the stenographer wrote them down, they added these words or changed them. So they're the ones that said evil act. Ahn Cheung-gun, I don't think, would ever have said evil act, because throughout his trial, he tried to argue that he was right to kill Ito Hirobumi, so it doesn't make any sense for him to say, my evil act. And in the case of Prince Ito, I have even stronger evidence, because a newspaper report from the time states explicitly that Ahn Cheung-gun did not use Prince Ito's title. He simply said Ito. Right? So, and clearly, in order to respect the Ito Hirobumi, either the interpreter or the person who wrote this down added Prince. Now, this is an example of minor editing. And I want to stress, I don't even think, even though these trial transcripts had this kind of minor editing, you can see that the main idea is still there. But in addition, I will argue that the autobiography doesn't even have this minor editing. Now, why have I gone through all this trouble to look at the trial transcripts? Isn't this talk about the autobiography? Well, here's the thing. Here is a very similar passage found in Ahn Cheung-gun's autobiography. And he's writing about the same time period, about 1907, and he writes, "My father became very sick at heart because of the pent-up rage he felt, and his health deteriorated further. I spoke to him in private, saying, when the struggle between Russia and Japan began," he's talking about the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, "Japan's declaration of war stated that it was fine to maintain peace in the East and strengthen Korean independence. But Japan has not lived up to those noble aspirations. Instead, it has launched a barbarous invasion. This is all the plan of that powerful politician, Ito. He first forced Korea to sign the treaty. Next, he will destroy people who think like us. Then he will gobble our country up. He is even now making new laws that will destroy it. If we do not act quickly, then we will face a great catastrophe in the future. Can we just sit here waiting to die?" So here you see Ahn Cheung-gun, or the author of the autobiography, who I argue is Ahn Cheung-gun, saying almost the exact same thing that we saw in the trial. He is connecting Korean independence with peace in the East, saying that you can't have peace in the East without Korean independence. And he's also blaming Ito, not all of Japan, for its problems. So we see that the ideas in both of these things are the same. So it makes sense, right, that if Ahn Cheung-gun was saying at the third trial session, was making this argument that connected these ideas together, and then another document, the autobiography, appears in which the same arguments are being made, and it claims to be by Ahn Cheung-gun, it probably is by Ahn Cheung-gun. In other words, we see consistency, right? We see consistency. We see a consistency of ideas and even style of writing, style of language, I should say, between these two documents. And that would seem to indicate that the autobiography is authentic. The ideas in the autobiography that claims to be written by Ahn and the ideas at the trial are the same, which is very strong evidence that Ahn Cheung-gun wrote the autobiography. So then we have to, though, ask ourselves, well, I'm arguing this is the most likely possibility. What are the others? We can't just consider this argument for the autobiography being written by Ahn Cheung-gun. We also have to consider the argument that someone else wrote it or that someone else edited it. So we have to ask ourselves then, if it wasn't Ahn who wrote the autobiography, then who was the author? Or if it was Ahn that wrote the autobiography and someone else edited it, who did the editing? Right? That's the first question we have to ask. Now there is another related question we have to ask, and that is motive. Why would someone either edit or completely forge these documents? And I can only think of two really credible reasons for why someone would do this. One would be for money, right? You could forge an important document and then sell it. And one thing I want to stress, of course, is the more interesting or more controversial the document is, the more money you could sell it for, right? If a document's boring or doesn't really tell us much or challenge anything, no one's going to buy it. But if you're going to forge something for money, you could forge a really cool historical document that will bring in some interesting things or will bring some controversy. Another reason that might lead someone to forge a document is ideology. You could forge a document that supports your ideology or that challenges someone else's ideology. So for example, if I want to take a particular policy, political policy, I might try and forge a document that shows an important person from the past supported that policy, right? Then that would help strengthen me. So let me give you a concrete example of this so we can kind of see how this would work. And that's the case of Mark Hoffman. And Mark Hoffman is the man on the far left, the guy who's not wearing a jacket. Mark Hoffman was born into a family that was a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This church is sometimes called the Mormon Church, or its members are sometimes called Mormons. The official name is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And Mark Hoffman was raised in that faith, but later lost his faith and was actually very angry at his former church. Now, he pretended to still be a believing Mormon, even though he lost his faith. But he was also someone who was very good at forging documents. And so what he started doing was forging documents about the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And he often forged documents that made the church look bad. And then he sold those documents for a lot of money. He either sold them to the church because the church didn't want those documents to become public, or he sold it to people who were enemies, opponents of that church. Right? So here's a case where you have someone who forged historical documents both to make money and for ideological reasons, right? He made a lot of money doing this, and also he made this church that he no longer believed in, he could make it look bad. He could hurt it, right? So that's why he did this. Now, he was eventually caught and is actually currently in jail. But this is, I just want to stress this point. And I also need to stress, he made these documents very controversial. He made them challenge basic ideas about the church's history, because by doing so, he knew he could hurt the church the most, and he could make the most money. Now, one thing I want to stress in terms of the Ahn autobiography, it has to be ideology, because no one really seems to have made much money on this, right? You're not going to make a whole lot of money with the Japanese translation, right? The one that was discovered in 1969. You're just not going to make a lot of money off that, because it's in Japanese. The main audience who'd be interested would be Korean. In addition, I want to stress, when the original Chinese was discovered in 1979, it was a document in the National Diet Library of Japan. So it wasn't the person who discovered it who owned it. It was the library that owned it, right? That owned the original source. So the person who discovered that wasn't going to make any money off that, right? So that's key. In that case, so I think there's not money involved here. It's not money. You're not going to get rich off the Ahn autobiography. So if it was done for ideological reasons, right? If this document was forged or edited, it had to be for ideological reasons, but whose? Right? It would either be the people who discovered the autobiography, their ideology, perhaps the Korean nationalists at the time of Ahn, perhaps a Korean nationalist after the annexation of Korea by Japan, perhaps a Japanese imperialist, or a Japanese anti-imperialist. Those are the people who might have forged or edited this document for ideological reasons. So if we look at this, first of all, if we just focus on the first one, the idea that the people who discovered the autobiography were the ones who forged it, there are some issues. Like I said, they don't appear to have made any money. As I said, the 1979 version was discovered in the library, so the guy who found it didn't even own it. But also, as I said before, there was nothing controversial about the autobiography. The autobiography does not fundamentally change how we understand Ahn, right? It allowed us to understand his life more deeply, his thought more deeply, but does not fundamentally change our understanding of who he was or what he thought. It's not particularly controversial. In the case of Mark Hoffman, he purposely made the documents he forged very controversial in order to maximize the amount of money he could make and to damage his church, former church, right? But there's nothing controversial about the autobiography, in my opinion. So it doesn't really work in that case. It also doesn't seem to support any contemporary ideologies. The autobiography, if you read it, is reflective of a 1909 Korean context of the ideological and the intellectual world of 1909 Korea, which is what we should expect if it was claimed to be written in 1909. It does not reflect either the Japan or Korea of the late 1960s or 1970s, right? There's nothing, in that time period, there was kind of a struggle in Japan about socialism, about liberalism, about war guilt and things like that. It does not appear, none of those things appear in the autobiography. And I also just want to highlight, there's these two manuscripts, and this is what's really confusing, right? If this was a forgery, it was extraordinarily elaborate, because there's these two different manuscripts, one in Japanese and then the classical Chinese one that the Japanese seems to have been translated from originally. So I think for those reasons, it's really hard to accept the idea that the people who discovered the autobiography are the ones who actually who would have forged this. I don't think that's the case at all. Now, there are some problems with the other possibilities as well, right? These other ones, that I previously mentioned. It was a Korean nationalist, it was pro-empire Japanese, it was anti-empire Japanese. Here's the case. If one of those people had forged this, why didn't they ever actually release it? Right? Why would they go to all the trouble to forge the autobiography and then not release it? I mean, I guess it's possible that they planned to and then something happened they didn't, but that just seems to raise to me, to make it all the more improbable, right? But I want to highlight that. If you were going to forge this document for ideological reasons, why wouldn't you actually release it, right? Remember, the document was lost. In addition, one thing I want to stress, the autobiography contains the basic message regarding the killing of Ito to convince Japan to change its policy. That does not fit the interests of those groups well. Korean nationalists were not likely to make the whole anti-Ito, anti-Japanese distinction. Korean nationalists living during the time of Korea's colonization by Japan would have been much more anti-Japanese. They would not have made this differentiation between like Ahn did between Ito and Japan. They realized that it wasn't simply one man's policy, so they tend to be more broadly anti-Japanese. I don't understand why a pro-empire Japanese person would have forged the autobiography. The autobiography is critical of Japan's empire in Korea, right? And one thing so it doesn't match its goals. And one thing I have to stress, that some pro-empire Japanese people actually did try and make claims about Ahn that were false. Some did actually try and claim that Ahn had repented of his killing of Ito. That one was actually claimed publicly. No one really believed it, and it just kind of died. Right? So they had tried to create their own narrative that Ahn had repented, but failed. And like I said, the autobiography just does not match that. Ahn does not ever repent of his idea of killing Ito Hirobumi. In fact, his autobiography, much of it is written explaining why it was right for him to kill Ito Hirobumi. The last group, anti-empire Japanese, I don't think they would have forged this for a variety of reasons. In general, the anti-empire Japanese were very open about their criticism of the empire. they would just say it. They don't need to forge something. They would just say it themselves, and they probably would not have chosen Ahn as the person to, if they were going to forge something, to act like he was the author, because a lot of them were socialists and pacifists who would not have approved of the assassination of Ito Hirobumi, even if they did not like Ito Hirobumi's policies. So I think it's very unlikely that they would have forged this. And they certainly wouldn't have chosen Ahn. But here's the big deal. Here's, to me, the big issue. You don't need to write Ahn Cheung-gun's autobiography to use Ahn to advance your own ideological goals. You could just write a biography. That would give you all the benefits without any of the risks. In fact, this happened. Just a few years after Ahn Cheung-gun died, people started writing autobiographies of him. For example, Park Eun-sik, a Korean nationalist, wrote a nationalist biography of Ahn Cheung-gun. He didn't need to write an autobiography. He just wrote a biography. In China, they made plays about Ahn Cheung-gun. In Korea now, they make all sorts of plays and dramas and things about Ahn Cheung-gun. They don't need to forge anything. They just tell the story of Ahn Cheung-gun, and they arrange and organize their story in a way that supports their views and their reading of Ahn Cheung-gun. And we'll look at some, and in the workshop, we'll actually look at some examples of that. So I think it's all highly improbable, right? I think it's highly improbable that any of these groups could have forged this document or edited it extensively. One of the key reasons also why I believe that Ahn Cheung-gun is the author of the autobiography is what I call the problematic passages, right? You may recall that I argued that Ahn Cheung-gun, when he wrote his autobiography, as I believe, he had three primary purposes. One was just a kind of general defense of his life. Another was the killing of Ito Hirobumi. And the third was as a kind of memoir, right? Basically, I argue that Ahn Cheung-gun, as he was in prison, and at first on trial for his life, and then while he was waiting for execution, he looked back at his life and he wrote down things that seemed important to him as a part of his life, and that were interesting, but that served no ideological purpose, right? And I'm going to give you some of those passages. And I think only if Ahn Cheung-gun was the one who wrote this autobiography, that's the only way we can explain these so-called problematic passages. So the first one is his actual description of the killing of Ito. Right, here it is in the autobiography. The Russian officials were walking in front of the soldiers. Ahead of them was an elderly little man with a yellow face and a white beard. How can this old man dare to go about so brazenly? Believing that was certainly that old thief Ito, I drew my pistol, and facing to the right, quickly fired 4 shots. But then I became worried that I had made a mistake, since I was not sure what Ito looked like. Such an error would be a major disaster. I looked at the people behind Ito. Among the Japanese there, the most dignified-looking one was walking in the front. I made him my target and quickly fired 3 times. Then I stopped and thought, if I mistakenly injured an innocent person, it would certainly be disgraceful. While I was thinking this, the Russian guards came and arrested me. So here's the thing, right? This does not make Ahn Cheung-gun look good from a Korean nationalist perspective, because he doesn't even know what Ito looks like. He's trying to kill Ito without knowing what Ito looks like, and he injures some other people, and he seems kind of indecisive because he says, well, I'm not sure quite what to do here. On the other hand, I think if someone who did not like Ahn Cheung-gun was looking at this, they would remove these parts where he explains that he felt bad. I think we can only explain this if we think that this was actually Ahn Cheung-gun describing what happened. Another problematic passage is this one. Even though I wanted to go to Harbin, I did not have the money to carry out my plans. I thought about it a great deal, and ended up deciding to go and visit a Korean independence officer from Hwanghae province named Lee Seok-san. And of course, Ahn's trying to go to Harbin to kill Ito. Lee was just about to go when I arrived at his home. I requested to meet with him, and he took me back to a private room in his house. I asked him to loan me 100 won. He refused. With matters being as they were, I felt I had no other choice than to threaten him and forced him to give me over 100 won. I then left. So in this case, again, Ahn Cheung-gun does not look particularly good. A Korean nationalist would never have done this. I think someone, though, who didn't like Ahn would have made him look even worse here. This next problematic passage, I think, is very entertaining. It's very interesting. Basically, in this passage, Ahn Cheung-gun was talking about how he tried to set up a lottery with some of his friends. And what ended up happening was when they did the draw to see who would win the lottery, there was a problem with the machine, so it selected multiple numbers at once. So this led to a kind of riot where people thought that they were trying to cheat them out of their money. And Ahn was nearly beaten up or even killed in the riot, but a man helped him. And Ahn wrote about this man in this way. I then talked with the man who had saved me. His family name was Ha, and his given name Pong. He was from North Hamgyong province. I thanked him, and we swore mutual brotherhood. We then feasted together and made merry. He could drink more than 100 cups of strong liquor without becoming even the slightest bit drunk. To show off his strength, he would make 30 or so hazel and juniper nuts and put them in the palms of his hands. Then, to the amazement of all, he rubbed his hands together like a millstone and ground them into powder. This serves no ideological purpose, right? This is just something entertaining Ahn remembered from his life, and something he thought was cool and wanted to include, right? I think that's the only way we can explain why this is a part of the autobiography. I think this passage is interesting because this is one I've had people say to me that they thought that this had been edited or edited. And this is on writing when he's young. He wrote, "At the time I was around 17 or 18 years old. As I matured, I grew physically and spiritually and was by no means inferior to others. Throughout my life, I enjoyed 4 things. Firstly, having close friends with whom I swore mutual loyalty. Secondly, drinking, singing, and dancing. Thirdly, going hunting with my rifle. And lastly, galloping around on fast horses. Whether it was near or far, if I heard that there was a gallant and brave man living somewhere, I would take up my gun and ride off on my horse in search of him. If he proved himself to be a kindred spirit, then I would converse with him and speak of what was in my heart. After we had drank as much as we liked and were quite drunk, we might dance or sing or visit a kisang house." So some people are kind of bothered by this passage because it shows Ahn as kind of a wild man. But I think that's maybe taking our contemporary morality and putting it on Ahn. I think this is just how a lot of young Korean men like to live during this time period. I don't think anyone who would have forged this would have seen this as particularly bad, right? Ahn was a Catholic. Drinking is fine in Catholicism. Frankly speaking, I would love to ride on around with a horse, hang around with my friends, and drink, sing, and dance, and eat and drink a lot. I mean, I think that would be great. It'd be a lot of fun. So I'm not sure if this is I don't see this as necessarily a bad thing. I think the audience of a Korean or Japanese audience reading this in 1909 and a Chinese audience, and those were the audiences Ahn was aimed at, I don't think they would have seen any problem with this. That this would have maybe even made Ahn seem more heroic, not less. Now, I think of all the possibilities of a passage being edited or added to the autobiography by someone who was pro-Japanese, I think this is the big one. This is Ahn writing while his time in jail. Every day in the morning and afternoon, I was taken from my cell to an office where I was provided with high-quality cigarettes from various countries and with lots of Western sweets and tea. Moreover, I was given a total of 3 meals a day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, all with high-quality white rice. I was able to exchange my old underclothes for new cotton ones and was specially supplied with 4 cotton futons. Apples, oranges, and pears were provided me 2 or 3 times a day, every day. By a special favor of Sanoki, I was given a daily bottle of milk. Prosecutor Mitsuo Buchi bought me chicken and tobacco and other such things for me. It would be difficult to describe all the kind things they did for me and impossible to thank them enough. So you could look at this and say, okay, this is Japanese propaganda. Ahn never would have written this. But remember, Ahn was not anti-Japanese. He was anti-Ito. So it didn't hurt his overall argument to say good things about Japanese people. In addition, we have to remember, Ahn was going to be going in for an international trial, right? A public trial. And so it made sense to treat him well, right? If they were to beat him or torture him or starve him, that the results of that bad treatment would be seen at trial and Japan would be criticized. So they treated him well so that Japan would be praised. And generally Japan was praised for how it treated Ahn by the foreign powers. In addition, they were hoping, I think, by treating him well that they could get information from him. For example, the Japanese government was not sure how many people had participated in the plot to kill Ito Hirobumi, and they hoped that by being nice to him, they would give him information. And that's a typical thing people do at interrogations. And also, despite this, Ahn never repents of killing Ito Hirobumi in the autobiography. If someone had forged this to make Japan look good, maybe they would have done even more, but they don't. So I think, again, this is just Ahn just saying what he thinks happened and giving thanks. And when you remember, keep in mind that Ahn also gave his jailers a lot of calligraphy. He gave them gifts, so it's not surprising that he would say something nice about them. Now, the last 2 problematic passages have to do with religion. particularly Catholicism, as Ahn was himself a very devout Catholic. In the first of these passages, he writes, and he's in the context of this is he was with his guerrilla army, his righteous army that he had helped lead into Korea, had been defeated by Japanese forces, and now they were fleeing away from Korea to safety. And he's not sure if he is going to survive. And he writes, he's traveling with a couple of his soldiers, and he writes, I exhorted my two companions, saying, believe what I'm about to tell you. If people do not serve the Lord of heaven, the great King and Father of heaven and earth, they are less than beasts. It will be difficult for us to escape death. You must believe in the way of the Lord Jesus. By doing so, you will have eternal life. And no one but a very devout Catholic, I think, would have included this passage. And there just simply weren't that many Catholics in Japan, China, and Korea at this time period. So I think it's more likely that Ahn Cheung-gun, known for being a devout Catholic, wrote this himself. And what's particularly important, then, is how Ahn Cheung-gun ends the autobiography. And he writes, Father Hong, and this is actually a French missionary, or a missionary priest associated with a French missionary order, but Ahn used his Korean name, Father Hong. Father Hong spoke to me of Catholic doctrine. The following day, he heard my confession. The day after that, he came to the prison to say Mass, and I partook of the Holy Sacrament of the Eucharist. How can I possibly thank the Lord of Heaven for this special grace? The officials of the jail came and participated in the Mass. The following day, at about 2 p.m, he came again to say, I will leave for Korea today, and I came to bid you farewell. We spoke for several hours and then shook hands and said our goodbyes. He told me, the benevolent Lord of heaven will not forsake you. He will take care of you. Do not worry. Be at peace. He held up his arms and gave me his blessing and then left. It was 4 p.m. on the first day of the second month, 1910. So here's something I really emphasize. The way you begin and the way you end a document are very important, right? Especially the ending, I think, is important. And Ahn Cheung-gun, or the author of this work, ends not with a call for Korea to fight for independence. It does not end with a call for Korea to accept Japanese imperialism. It ends with a man talking about finding spiritual comfort before his coming execution. That, I think, is some of the best evidence that Ahn Cheung-gun wrote this document himself. Right? I think that's some of the key evidence that Ahn Cheung-gun wrote this document himself. Right? Only a very devout Catholic would have written this in this way. Someone who forged this, I don't see why they would include something like this. So in conclusion, history being history, we cannot know with 100% accuracy. We can't know with certainty. But it is highly probable, in fact most probable, that it was Ahn Cheung-gun who wrote the history of Ahn Eungchil, because only if he was the author can we not only explain the fact that this document defends his life, defends the choices he made in his life, holds the position that Japan should change its policy, but most of all, that it is a memoir that includes things that have nothing to do with ideology, that are not controversial to make money, that are best explained by a man preparing to die looking back at his life, and therefore it is most probable. If there was some editing, it was probably very minor. I don't think there was any editing. I don't see any evidence of that. We've seen what minor editing looks like, and we haven't seen that here. So I think if you want to know what Ahn Cheung-gun thought through his own words, this is a trustworthy source. And I would highly encourage you, if you've not read the autobiography, to do so. It's a fascinating document.